He had played piano for 60 years. He had never once heard what his music meant to strangers. That was about to change, and nobody in Studio 6A was ready for it. It was a Wednesday night at the Late Show with Stephen Colbert. The kind of night that feels ordinary right up until the moment it isn't. The band was loose and warm, the audience electric with that particular New York energy that arrives on cool autumn evenings when people are grateful just to be inside somewhere bright. Paul Landisberg's orchestra had just finished a rolling, bluesy intro that bounced off the high ceilings of the Ed Sullivan Theater and settled into the bones of everyone sitting in those red velvet seats. Stephen Colbert walked out to his mark the way he always did, grinning, adjusting his glasses, nodding at the crowd like they were old friends he hadn't seen in a week. The audience responded the way they always did, loud, immediate, warm. Nobody knew that in 47 minutes, this room would go completely silent. Not from technical failure, not from controversy, from something rarer and harder to manufacture than either of those things. From truth. The guest that night was not a movie star. He was not a politician, not a best-selling author, not a tech billionaire with a book about disruption. He was an 84-year-old jazz pianist from New Orleans named Arthur Millfield, and most people in that audience had never heard his name. His publicist had booked him a segment, 7 minutes, to discuss a newly reissued vinyl collection of his recordings from the 1970s. A small label had pressed 3,000 copies. It was a modest thing, a quiet tribute to a quiet career. Arthur arrived at the theater 2 hours early, the way old men do when punctuality has become the last form of dignity they can fully control. He wore a dark gray suit that had been tailored sometime in the early 90s and still fit him almost perfectly. His hands, enormous, long-fingered, slightly swollen at the knuckles, rested on his thighs as a production assistant walked him through the backstage corridor. He looked at everything with the patient curiosity of someone who had stopped being surprised by the world, but had never stopped being interested in it. A junior producer offered him coffee. He asked for hot water with lemon. "Mr. Millfield," she said, glancing at her tablet, "we'll have you out there for about 7 minutes. Stephen will ask about the reissue, maybe 1 or 2 questions about your career, and then—" "That's fine," Arthur said, not dismissively, just simply, like a man who had learned that 7 minutes was enough time for almost anything that mattered. He was wrong about tonight. Tonight would need more than 7 minutes. Tonight would need as long as it needed. Stephen had done his homework, the way he always did. 3 pages of notes, handwritten, sitting in a folder on his desk. He knew that Arthur Millfield had released 11 albums between 1968 and 1991. He knew that Arthur had played with legends, names that made jazz historians lean forward in their chairs, but had always remained slightly outside the circle of fame. A sideman who became a bandleader who never quite became a household name. What the notes didn't tell him, what nobody had thought to include, was the other thing. The thing that changed everything. The first 4 minutes of the interview were exactly what the producers expected. Stephen asked about New Orleans. Arthur talked about growing up hearing music through the walls of every building, music that seeped through plaster and brick like weather. Stephen asked about the reissue. Arthur described the strange sensation of hearing your younger self play, like reading a letter you wrote as a child and recognizing the handwriting but not quite the thinking behind it. The audience laughed at that. Stephen laughed too. It was good television. Warm, intelligent, the kind of conversation that ages well. And then a woman in the 4th row raised her hand. This almost never happens on late show tapings. The format doesn't allow for it. Audience members are briefed before every show. No interruptions, no shouting, no phones. The show runs on a tight clock, and any deviation costs time, that costs money, that costs everyone a headache. But she raised her hand anyway, a woman in her mid-50s, gray-streaked hair pulled back, wearing a burgundy cardigan. Her name, as the world would later learn, was Diane Kowalski, a retired hospice nurse from Scranton, Pennsylvania, who had won her tickets in a radio contest 6 weeks earlier. Stephen saw her. He paused, that particular pause he does when something shifts in the room and his instincts tell him to follow the shift instead of the script. "Hold on," he said to Arthur. Then to Diane, do you have something you want to say?" The microphone runner was already moving. Diane stood. Her hands were clasped in front of her. When she spoke, her voice was steady in the way that voices get steady when a person has been rehearsing something for a very long time without knowing they were rehearsing it. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. "I'm a hospice nurse. I worked with dying patients for 23 years. She stopped, breathed. "And I need this man to know something." The room had already shifted. You could feel it, that drop in ambient noise that happens when 300 people collectively decide to stop fidgeting. "3 years ago," Diane continued, "I had a patient, 71 years old, lung cancer, end stage. He hadn't spoken in 4 days. His family was there taking shifts, but he was gone in the way that people go before they actually go." She looked directly at Arthur. "I put on music. His daughter had left a playlist, and one of the songs was yours, Harbor Light, from your 1974 album." Arthur's expression didn't change immediately. He was listening with the focused stillness of someone who has learned to receive information before reacting to it. "He opened his eyes," Diane said. "He hadn't opened his eyes in 2 days. He turned his head toward the speaker, and he smiled. He died 40 minutes later, still smiling." She pressed her lips together. "I just thought you should know that your song was the last beautiful thing he heard." The silence that followed was the kind that television producers spend entire careers trying to create and almost never can, because it cannot be written, cannot be cued, cannot be manufactured in any post-production suite on Earth. Stephen Colbert said nothing. Arthur Millfield said nothing. The band said nothing. 300 people said nothing. Here is where the story splits in two, and both halves are true simultaneously, which is the thing about music that Arthur had always understood and never been able to explain. The first half, Arthur had written Harbor Light in 1973. Sitting at an upright piano in a rented room in the French Quarter during the worst year of his life. His marriage had just ended. His label had dropped him. He was 41 years old and quietly certain that his best work was behind him. He wrote the song in 40 minutes, almost without thinking, the way you sometimes say the truest things when you've stopped trying to be careful. He recorded it as a B-side. He almost didn't include it on the album. His producer had shrugged at it. "It's fine," the producer had said. "It's quiet." "It's quiet" had turned out to mean, it will outlast everything louder around it. The second half, in the 49 years since Arthur had written Harbor Light, the song had traveled to places he had never been, into rooms he had never entered, to people he had never met. It had played in a hospital in Portland during a surgery that lasted 11 hours. It had been chosen by a high school orchestra in rural Montana as their graduation piece in 1989, performed imperfectly and magnificently by 17 teenagers who felt, without knowing why, that the melody said something important about leaving. It had played in a nursing home in Phoenix every Sunday morning for 6 years, because one activity coordinator thought it was the most peaceful thing she'd ever heard. It had been a first dance at a wedding in Vermont, a last song at a funeral in Georgia, a lullaby in an apartment in Chicago at 3 in the morning, when a new mother was too exhausted to think, and her daughter would only sleep if something was playing. Arthur had known none of this. He had written a song alone in a room during the worst year of his life, and the song had quietly gone out into the world and done what songs do when they're honest. It had found the people who needed it. He had never received a letter about it, never a phone call, never an email, never a review that mentioned it by name. His royalty statements had listed it without comment. For 49 years, Harbor Light had lived a secret life that its creator knew nothing about. Until a woman in a burgundy cardigan stood up in a television studio and told him. Stephen leaned back slightly in his chair. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but the cameras caught it. It was the movement of a man recalibrating, deciding, in real time, that what he'd planned to do next was no longer the right thing to do. He looked at Arthur. Arthur was looking at his hands, those enormous, long-fingered hands that had pressed the keys that had made the song that had traveled to rooms he'd never seen. His jaw was set. His eyes were dry but working hard to stay that way. Arthur, Stephen said, and his voice had changed, the performance register completely gone, replaced by something quieter and more careful. Did you know any of it? Arthur looked up slowly. No, he said, just that. One syllable, plainly delivered, carrying the weight of a half-century of not knowing. Stephen nodded. Let the silence sit another moment. Then, can I ask you something? When you wrote that song, Harbor Light, what were you writing it about? Arthur almost smiled. Leaving, he said. I was writing about leaving something behind and not knowing if it was worth anything. The room absorbed that. Stephen said very quietly, I think you got your answer. What happened in the next 6 minutes was not planned by any producer, not outlined in any rundown, not accounted for in any segment timing sheet. Stephen asked the band, Paul's band, the orchestra that had been playing the same stage for years, if anyone knew Harbor Light. One of the keyboardists, a woman named Renata who had studied jazz piano at Berkeley and owned every Arthur Millfield album ever pressed, looked up from her instrument and said, I know it. Stephen looked at Arthur. Would you play it with her? Arthur was quiet for a moment. It's been a while, he said. That's okay, Stephen said. Take your time. They brought a second keyboard to the stage. Arthur sat down at it with the careful ease of a man who has been sitting at pianos his entire life and knows exactly how to lower himself onto a bench. He touched the keys once, not playing, just touching, the way you touch something to remember it. And then he began. It was not a perfect performance. Arthur's left hand was slower than it used to be, and once he lost the melody for a half measure before finding it again. Renata followed him without hesitation, filling in where he hesitated, quieting when he surged, moving with him the way good musicians move with each other, not leading, not following, just listening. The audience did not applaud during the song. They did not make sounds of appreciation or encouragement. They simply listened, in the same way that the dying man in the hospital room in Scranton had listened, with the particular attention that people give to things they recognize as true. Diane Kowalski, still standing in the fourth row, sat down slowly partway through the second verse. Her eyes were closed. Her hands were still clasped. Stephen sat at his desk and did not move. When the song ended, the silence lasted 4 full seconds before the applause came, and when it came, it was not the polite, rhythmic applause of a television audience following social cues. It was the kind of applause that means, we needed that, and we didn't know we needed it until right now. After the show, backstage, Arthur sat in the green room with a cup of hot water and lemon that had gone cold. A production assistant offered to reheat it. He declined. Stephen came in still wearing his microphone pack, which meant he'd walked straight from the set without stopping at the desk for the usual post-show debrief. He sat down across from Arthur without preamble. Are you all right? He asked. I've been writing music for 60 years, Arthur said, and I never thought to wonder where it went after I let it go. He looked at his hands again. I think that was a mistake. Stephen shook his head slowly. I don't know. Maybe the not knowing was part of it. Maybe the song could go where it needed to go because you weren't holding on to it. Arthur considered this. That's generous of you. I mean it. A pause, then Arthur said, that woman, Diane. We got her information, Stephen said, if you want to reach out. Arthur nodded. I'd like to thank her. She came here to thank you. I know, Arthur said. That's why I'd like to thank her. The episode aired the following Thursday. The clip of Diane's speech, 37 seconds, was shared more than 4 million times in the first week. Harbor Light appeared on streaming charts for the first time in its 50-year existence, reaching a peak it had never come close to during the decade it was actually released. 3,000 vinyl pressings sold out in 11 days. A second pressing was ordered. Arthur did reach out to Diane. They spoke on the phone for 40 minutes. Diane told him about the patient. His name was Gerald Hooper, a retired electrician who had loved jazz without ever studying it, who had owned a record player but very few records. Arthur listened to all of it. When Diane finished, Arthur said, "Thank you for being in that room with him." Diane said, "Thank you for writing something worth being in the room." Stephen mentioned it once more, briefly, in his monologue 3 weeks later. Not as a bit, not as a joke, just as a thing he wanted to say. "I've been doing this show for 10 years, he said, and I still don't know exactly what it's for. But I think a couple weeks ago I got the closest I've come to an answer. Sometimes the job is just to make enough space for the true things to come through. We didn't do that. A woman from Scranton did. We just left the cameras on." The audience laughed because Stephen had said it with a smile. But he meant every word of it, and the people who knew him knew he meant it. Arthur Millfield returned to New Orleans the morning after the tapping. The flight was early and he slept through most of it, his enormous hands folded in his lap. When the plane broke through the clouds on descent and the flat green sprawl of Louisiana came into view below, he thought about the song, about the 40 minutes it had taken to write, about the 49 years it had been traveling without him. He thought about Gerald Hooper, an electrician he had never met, who had died smiling. He thought, that is more than most songs get to do. That is more than most people get to do. When the wheels touched the runway, Arthur Millfield closed his eyes and let out a long, slow breath, not grief, not relief, not exactly joy, but something that contained all three. The particular feeling of a man who has been told, late in life, that the thing he made in the dark was worth making. The engines wound down, the cabin lights brightened. He picked up his bag and walked off the plane and into the morning. Some songs are written in the worst year of a life and end up in the best moment of a stranger's. That is not an accident. That is what music is for. And sometimes, if you're lucky, if you stay quiet long enough, if a woman in a burgundy cardigan decides to raise her hand, you get to find out.